Rain clouds gathered above the city that afternoon, but outside Mercy General Hospital, the real storm had already begun. The wind carried the smell of wet asphalt and exhaust, mixing with the faint sound of sirens in the distance. On the hospital's front drive, a 6-year-old girl stood trembling beside the curb, her small fingers clutching the folds of her sky-blue dress. Dirt streaked her knees and cheeks, and tears had carved thin, pale lines through the grime. Her voice cracked as she tried to speak, but the hum of traffic drowned her words. Around her, people moved like ghosts, walking past, glancing over, pretending not to see. Her name was Sophie Turner, a child too young to understand cruelty, but old enough to recognize fear. If you believe that kindness still matters, that good hearts still rise when darkness closes in, take a second to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Loom. Because what happened that day will remind you why humanity is still worth believing in. Sophie's mother, Laura Turner, had been fighting exhaustion for months. She was a waitress at the Bluebird Diner, a small roadside place that smelled of coffee and fried onions, working double shifts to pay for her antibiotics after a severe infection weakened her lungs. But her body couldn't take it anymore. That morning, as she reached for a glass of water, her vision blurred and she collapsed in front of her daughter. Sophie did what any child would. She ran barefoot into the street, shouting for help, holding her mother's limp hand. A kind passerby helped call an ambulance, but the nearest hospital was less than a mile away. So the little girl helped her mother to her feet, step by step, until the tall glass doors of Mercy General finally came into view. Only fate had a cruel sense of humor that day. The hospital's main entrance was under renovation. A temporary gate had been set up along the side lot, guarded by 3 construction contractors who had been told to keep the area clear. They weren't security guards, just laborers on break. Rough, impatient men who looked at every person like a problem they didn't want to deal with. When Laura staggered toward them, clutching her chest, they didn't move. The tallest one, wearing a gray sleeveless hoodie and a cigarette hanging from his lips, waved them off. "Emergencies around back," he said lazily, though the back entrance had been closed for weeks. Laura tried to speak but couldn't. Her chest heaved, her breath short and wheezing. Sophie tugged at the man's arm, crying, begging, but he just laughed. The second man, lean with a patchy beard, took out his phone and started recording, chuckling as if it were some kind of street performance. The third, heavier and older, wearing a red flannel shirt smeared with paint, muttered something about people always making a scene. Laura's knees buckled once, then again. Her hand pressed against the glass doors as she slid down to the ground. Sophie screamed for help, her voice rising above the wind, but the world seemed to turn away. Cars drove past, faces in windows turned elsewhere. The few pedestrians nearby crossed to the other side of the street, and then, through the sound of the rain beginning to fall, came a deep, rolling thunder that wasn't from the sky. Motorcycles, 5 of them, slow and steady, their engines rumbling like a heartbeat under the gray clouds. The sound grew louder until even the contractors paused. Chrome glinted under the light. Black leather, denim, and patches marked with a winged iron emblem came into view. The name stitched beneath it read Iron Saints MCT. The head of the group was a man built like the road itself. Broad shoulders, weathered face, and eyes that carried miles of stories. His name was Ryder Callen. Late 40s, hands scarred from work, beard touched with silver. He'd been through enough in life to know when something was wrong. The bike slowed to a stop near the hospital gate. The engines idled for a few seconds before going quiet, leaving behind only the ticking sound of cooling metal and the patter of rain. Ryder's gaze swept over the scene. The crying child, the woman slumped against the door, the 3 men standing in her way. For a long moment, no one spoke. Sophie turned toward the bikers, her small frame trembling. She wiped her eyes and whispered, almost too softly to hear, "Please, "Those men won't let my mommy in." Ryder crouched down in front of her. His jacket creaked as he met her gaze, and for a moment the world went still. Then he stood, his expression hardening. Without a word, he handed his gloves to one of his men and started walking toward the gate. The others followed, 5 dark silhouettes moving like a tide of quiet resolve. The 3 contractors stiffened. The man in the hoodie straightened, dropping his cigarette. The one with the phone lowered it quickly, pretending to check a message. But Ryder didn't stop. His boots echoed with every step until he stood just inches away. "Move," he said simply. His voice was low but carried the weight of command. The man in the hoodie tried to smirk. "You can't tell us what to," he never finished. Ryder's stare cut him off mid-sentence, sharp and steady as steel. Behind him, his brothers fanned out. A mountain of a man named Mace, a quiet rider called Doc, a younger one known as Sparrow, and their road captain, Kane. None of them said a word. The silence alone was enough. The tallest contractor looked around, suddenly unsure. "We were just doing our job," he mumbled. Ryder didn't blink. "Then do it right. Step aside." They did with slow, deliberate movements. The men backed away, leaving the doorway clear. Ryder knelt beside Laura, who was barely conscious now, her breathing shallow. Gently, he lifted her arm and pulled it around his shoulder. "You're going in," he said quietly. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the nurses rushed forward. Voices filled the air, urgent, professional, alive. A stretcher appeared, hands guiding Laura inside. Sophie ran beside her, holding her mother's fingers until they disappeared behind a curtain. Outside, the Iron Saints stood guard under the rain. None of them moved, their presence alone enough to keep the cowards silent. When Ryder finally stepped back out, his boots splashing in the puddles, Sophie ran to him. She wrapped her small arms around his leg, crying again, but this time from relief. Ryder bent down, brushing the wet hair from her forehead. "You did good, little one," he said softly. "You're braver than most men I know." He didn't stay long. Before leaving, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded $20 bill. He pressed it into Sophie's hand and smiled faintly. "For your mom's medicine." On the bill, scrawled in black ink, were 3 words. "For her tomorrow." Then he stood, nodded once to the staff who had gathered by the doors, and walked back to his bike. The engines came alive again, growling through the rain as the Iron Saints rode away into the fading light. That moment became a whisper that spread through the hospital like wildfire. Nurses talked about it in the cafeteria, doctors in the hallway. Some said the men looked like angels. Others said they looked like trouble. But everyone agreed on one thing: that day something rare had happened. Inside the emergency ward, Laura was stabilized. Her infection had worsened, but because she'd been brought in just in time, the doctors managed to start the right treatment. She woke later that evening to the sound of quiet breathing beside her bed. Sophie was asleep, curled up in the chair, still holding the folded bill in her small hand. When Laura tried to speak, her voice was weak. "Who helped us?" she asked. Sophie's eyes fluttered open, and she smiled. "Angels, Mommy. The Iron Saints." For the next few days, the story rippled through the city. Someone had filmed part of it the moment Ryder carried Laura through the doors. It spread online, reaching thousands of people who saw not a gang of bikers, but men with hearts that refused to look away. Ryder didn't care much for attention. He was a man who preferred the road, who knew the sound of loss better than applause. Years earlier, he'd lost his wife to illness after being denied care at a clinic that refused to treat patients without insurance. Maybe that's why, when he saw Laura struggling at the gate, something inside him broke loose. To him, it wasn't about being a hero. It was about not letting another man's mistake become a child's heartbreak. A week later, Laura was discharged. She was thinner, paler, but alive. Sophie held her hand as they stepped outside the hospital. The air smelled cleaner that morning, the rain having washed the city streets. They didn't expect to see anyone waiting, but parked across the street under a flickering streetlight were two motorcycles. Ryder was sitting on one, helmet resting on his knee. He looked up as they walked over. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Laura smiled weakly. "Better. Thanks to you." He shook his head. "You did the hard part. We just cleared the road." Sophie handed him a small, folded paper. It was a drawing she'd made in the hospital. A crayon sketch of a woman lying on a hospital bed, a little girl holding her hand, and 5 figures in leather jackets standing outside under the rain. At the top, in her shaky handwriting, she had written, "Thank you for being our angels." Ryder took it carefully, looking at it for a long time before sliding it into his vest pocket. "We'll keep it safe," he said. Then he nodded, started his bike, and rode off with the other Iron Saints trailing behind him. Their engines faded into the distance like the echo of thunder rolling away. Days turned to weeks, and life slowly returned to normal. Laura went back to work, this time part-time, and the diner owner, having seen the video, set up a small fundraiser jar by the counter labeled for Sophie's mom. People began dropping coins and bills into it, strangers leaving notes that simply said, "Be well." Sophie never forgot the men who helped her. Every time she heard a motorcycle in the distance, she'd run to the window and smile. And somewhere out there on the open road, Ryder and his crew kept riding. Never for glory, never for thanks, but because they knew the world was full of gates that still needed opening. If the story touched your heart, if you still believe that kindness can come from where you least expect it, please like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Loom. It helps stories like this reach more hearts and remind the world that compassion hasn't gone out of style. Before we end, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were there that day? Would you have stepped forward, even if no one else did? Because sometimes, one act of courage is all it takes to change someone's forever.